Bonjour, très impressionnée d'être devant un parterre aussi rempli de visages réjouis. Nous sommes très heureux, et je suis très heureuse en tant que directrice de la FEMIS, d'accueillir aujourd'hui cet après-midi de recherche qui célèbre la rencontre en fait de deux représentantes éminentes du féminisme mondial. On le fait donc dans le cadre de ce qui s'appelle SACRe, qui est un doctorat de recherche et création qui relie l'ensemble des écoles d'art parisiennes et que nous sommes donc très heureux de permettre des rencontres récurrentes avec les étudiants de ces différentes écoles et les étudiants en doctorat. Donc aujourd'hui, nous avons fait le choix de réunir sur ce plateau ces deux personnes qui abordent à des moments différents de l'histoire la question politique du point de vue sur le monde, du regard sur le monde que le cinéma exerce et la manière dont les femmes ont probablement été longtemps exclues de ce regard. Donc ces deux personnes sont Laura Mulvey, qui est désormais une habituée de la FEMIS, parce qu'elle était venue il y a 5 ans déjà participer à une journée de recherche où elle nous avait exposé la manière dont sa théorie sur le male gaze résonnait avec le cinéma contemporain. Donc merci Laura de revenir, on est très heureuse. Et puis de l'autre, Céline Sciamma, qu'on ne présente plus, qui est un peu la régionale de l'État, puisqu'elle a été dans cette école, donc cinéaste, créatrice de 50-50, et dont on connaît l'acuité du regard sur les questions justement de représentation et de l'enjeu politique de la place des femmes, de la manière de les filmer, de la manière de raconter le monde. Et donc nous sommes évidemment très heureuses aussi, très heureux de l'accueillir aujourd'hui parmi nous.
Je vais présenter nos intervenantes rapidement, même si vous les connaissez sans doute très très bien déjà. Donc Laura Mulvey est l'autrice de plusieurs ouvrages et textes fondateurs, Visual and Other Pleasures, Citizen Kane, Fetishism and Curiosity, Death 24 Times a Second et After Images on Film Women and Changing Times. Et elle a réalisé également plusieurs films, 6 films en collaboration avec Peter Warren, parmi lesquels Riddles of the Sphinx, dont on va voir quelques extraits, Frida Kahlo and Tina Modotti, et également d'autres films, et puis des films plus récemment avec l'artiste Mark Lewis, notamment Disgraced Monuments et 23 August 2008. So thank you very much, Laura, for being here today with us. Céline Sciamma, scénariste et réalisatrice, diplômée de la FEMIS, qui a réalisé Naissance des pieuvres, Tomboy, Bande de filles, Portrait de la jeune fille en feu et Petite maman en 2021, et a écrit le scénario de Ma vie de courgette. Merci également d'être parmi nous. Et enfin, Chloé Lavalette, donc, que Nathalie a présenté rapidement, qui est doctorante en études théâtrales et comédienne et qui travaille à proposer dans sa thèse des perspectives pour l'analyse de la nudité sur les scènes théâtrales et chorégraphiques contemporaines. Merci également d'être là. Juste une précision sur la langue. Donc, on a fait le choix pour cette rencontre que chacun s'exprime dans sa langue, sachant que toutes nos intervenantes comprennent l'anglais et le français, mais voilà, on a privilégié le fait qu'on puisse parler anglais avec Laura Mulvey et que si la prise de parole est plus aisée en français, on puisse basculer sur le français afin d'assurer une fluidité maximale des échanges. Donc voilà. Donc pour ces rencontres, on commence en général par une prise de parole inaugurale en l'occurrence de Laura Mulvey, qui va nous parler du contexte de la création de Riddles of the Sphinx. Et ensuite, on projettera un extrait, ou peut-être même 2 extraits à la suite de ce film. Et puis, suite à quoi la discussion sera lancée. Et voilà, Chloé interviendra et on aura des questions pour toutes les 2. Donc, je vous laisse la parole, Laura.
Merci. Je suis ravie d'être ici. Je suis très reconnaissante le FEMIS et à mes interlocuteurs. Mais je vais parler en anglais. C'est plus facile pour moi. À mon âge, c'est un peu difficile parler le français. So, thank you all very much, and it's wonderful to be here. And I wanted to make 4 points of an introduction before we see the extracts of the film. And I'm going to try and speak slowly. And if there are any points or questions you'd like to bring up later, we can come back. But just because I'm speaking in English, I thought I would tell you in advance what the 4 points I'm going to discuss are. First of all, I'm going to give a quick introduction to emphasize the passing of time between the 1970s, when I was making these films, and now. What a different period of history. Secondly, how Peter Wallen, my co-director, and I made the transition from writing about film to making films. Thirdly, goodness, what was my third point? Thirdly, how it was possible for us to make these rather strange films at that time. And finally, the last point, just a few thoughts about our strategies and how we approached making films, and particularly in order to introduce the extracts of Riddles of the Sphinx. Does that sound okay? That's a good thing. Yeah. So first of all, I want to evoke a very short period in British history, which is an arc which affects both our political history and the history of the independent film movement, and Peter Wallen's and my personal history. So I've visualized it like a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's called in England the long 1970s, beginning with 1968 and the radicalization that we were influenced by the French, needless to say, and the radicalization around 1968, which then finished in 1979 and the late 80s with the election of Margaret Thatcher and the arrival of neoliberal politics, very particularly ending in 1973-4 with the defeat of the miners' strike and the victory of the Falklands War, which changed our political perspectives. For independent film movement, 1968 was when the London Filmmakers Co-op was founded, which was the first arrival of artists' film, and I'm ending it in 1982-3, which was when our fourth channel, Channel 4 television, came on the air. And whereas you might say the election of Margaret Thatcher was a purely bad thing, the arrival of Channel 4 television was mixed. In some ways, it was positive. In some ways, it was complicated for independent film. So this is the arc within which Peter Wallen and I made our 6 films. And our films shifted very much according to the kind of political context in which we were working. So now I wanted to just say, Barbara, will you watch the time as well? So I don't, yeah. So thinking about my presentation to you today, I was so conscious of looking back 50 years, how much has changed between then and now. So this is to emphasize the antiquity of the moment in which I made films, and as I was saying to Barbara and the others earlier, also myself as a kind of archaeological object, a kind of piece of history. So I was just thinking that, for instance, for the whole, up till the 1970s, film had by and large stayed the same. It might have been different in styles, but it had been emerging from the projection room, from the projector, in reels, into darkened rooms. And since then, as we all know, there's been an explosion, an eruption, a revolution in film technology, which to my mind has revolutionized modes of spectatorship and also understanding of film. Secondly, women's creativity. 50 years ago, women's voices were still struggling to be heard across arts, culture, politics, more widely in society. And although still very much underrepresented, though I hear about the 50-50 movement, for which I vous félicite, c'est vraiment formidable. But so women contribute considerably more. Women's creativity is, I think, become much more, made much more impact on society today than 50 years ago. And this is something for celebration, but also for to be méfiante, il faut le garder. Thirdly, questions of sexuality. 50 years ago, gay, lesbian liberation movements had changed ideology on sexuality, but there was still very much a heterosexual norm. And nowadays, since then, the question of gender has become infinitely more expanded, more with questions of trans and so on over the last few years, changing the way in which gender and sexuality are understood. And finally, my final point is about race. Of course, 50 years ago, we were conscious of the importance of race and racial politics. But recently, over the last few years, and perhaps we might say particularly since the Black Lives Matter movement, questions of race have become questions of everyday politics and everyday consciousness. So those are 4 ways, I'm sure there are others, in which ways in which we think about our area have changed over the years. So, secondly, how did Peter and I shift from writing about film to making films? We both started in writing critiques of dominant cinema. So in a sense, I'm trying to put together 2 points of engagement. One is to do with critique, and the other is to do more with creativity. So one is to do with trying to analyze dominant images and dominant modes and conventions of film, and the other is thinking about what possible alternatives there might be. And so how did we move from writing about or patriarchal film culture into practical theoretical work with film? So there was a sense of a shift into a kind of urgency of this work, and also, for me, the immediate impact of the women's liberation movement in the early 1970s, and for which changed almost suddenly the way that I saw cinema. And films, as I was saying to Céline, having loved Hollywood, having learnt from the Cahiers du Cinéma to understand and love Hollywood, the films that I'd found so moving, I saw differently. Instead of being absorbed, I sat back and saw completely different images on the screen under the influence of feminism. Peter had become very interested in radical aesthetics, the historical avant-gardes, and in what ways it was possible to draw on avant-garde movements, both contemporary and historical, in order to critique dominant cinema. And out of this, I wrote Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, and Peter wrote an essay which was inspired by Jean-Luc Godard's film Vent d'Est, called Counter-Cinema, in which he came up with the 7 cardinal virtues and the 7 sins of cinema. And this was important for us because it suggested the idea that you could negate the dominant. You could come up with a negative aesthetic. We wanted to expand our theoretical work in writing into theoretical work with films. Always there'd been in the avant-garde poetic films, poetry films, art films, artist films. We wanted to pursue ideas films and think of ways in which we could translate thought into the cinema. Now, you could say this was all very well, this was a good idea, but how is it going to be possible? So this brings me on to my third point. All very well to hope to make theory films, but it only became possible because there was an environment favourable to experiment in the UK at the time. Within the arc of, I explained at the beginning, a movement of experimental film and independent film grew up in the UK. And there was a kind of collective solidarity in which filmmakers, both from one side, say from artist filmmakers, right the way through to the Marxist collectives, and women's groups, joined together in the Independent Filmmakers Association in 1974. And I want to emphasize that this movement wasn't just making films. A lot of it was writing, publishing little magazines, very important film festivals, the Edinburgh Film Festival, screenings where I saw for the first time, films by Chantal Akerman, by Yvonne Reyna, by Valley Export, and realized that there were these very grand, important films being made by women. And this was all due to this kind of activity, curatorial, writing, making, just talking as well, activity at the time. But again, with all of that activity, it was also important to have finance, to have some state support. And from the British Film Institute and the Arts Council, these kinds of strange films actually found a little bit of money. We didn't need much money, but we needed a little bit of money. And Riddles of the Sphinx, for instance, was made by the British Film Institute, produced by the British Film Institute, and cost £20,000, which in those days wasn't much, and it included childcare. Now, also very important for us was the influence of new cinemas. New cinemas like Chantal Akerman, as I mentioned, but also Straub-Huillet, also cinemas from Latin America, cinemas from Africa, all of which suggested that there were new possibilities, new ways of thinking about storytelling, and new ways of making images. And also these new films also suggested that film language was something that needed political thought. So the stand against transparency, the obviousness of the image, was replaced by a kind of sense of the importance of actual modes of production and the visibility of modes of production. Oh, I see what I've gone on. got my wrong page. Yeah, and so out of this, I wanted to mention in particular, there was a sense of an imperfect cinema coming from the ideas of Getino and Solanas, Argentinian filmmakers, experimental filmmakers, writers, who said you should aim not for perfection, but for imperfection. And also, in a sense, the idea of the arte povera, an Italian idea of kind of poor arts. And I think very much in keeping with that was something which was very important in the UK, probably not so much in France, was 16mm film. Handheld 16mm, the informality of 16, and also the way in which women were able to appropriate the more informal technology. For me, and I think for the women's movement in general, there were also important theoretical influences. So I wanted to mention how, alongside avant-garde aesthetics, we were influenced by psychoanalysis and Freudian ideas. Now, this seems kind of shocking today. People say Freud, misogyny. But for us, there was something about the way that Freud came up with an idea of the unconscious that we used to analyze the unconscious of patriarchy and the way in which images of women circulated in patriarchy, particularly the images of women sexualized, eroticized, produced a discordance between what the image seemed to represent, woman, and what it actually might represent, the fetishistic and anxious patriarchal unconscious. Now, this involved seeing within representation, seeing a gap in the image, which in a sense was also a semiotic gap between what the image seemed to signify and what it actually signified. So the different semiotics and psychoanalysis both kind of came to our aid here. And I think possibly for the first time, perhaps, I don't know if I'm exaggerating, say the first time in history, images became a political issue. So for the women's movement from the very beginning, the woman's body had been a political issue, a site of struggle, a site in which you struggled for your own sexuality, for your rights of reproduction, your struggle against violence. But then, logically, if the body was a site of struggle, then the image of the body also became a site of struggle. And so representation moved into the political forum, as it were. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so that made questions of representation a matter of political struggle, I think, very much for the first time. So although economic and social forces could be seen as perhaps key in women's oppression, images and representation and the struggle against them was also included. I won't say anything more about psychoanalysis here because we could come back to it perhaps later if we're talking about visual pleasure and so on. So now I want to go on to my final point, which is the kinds of cinematic strategies that Peter and I were influenced by, or we came up with. First of all, as we were working collaboratively, it was very important to agree what we wanted to do. There's no point going onto the set and saying, what are we going to do today? And so our films were very programmatic. They were worked out in advance. And the idea of counter-cinema, the idea of negating the dominant conventions, gave us, as it were, a first step towards coming up with strategy and style. And the first point that was really important to us was, in a sense, countering the traditions and conventions of editing. So it was kind of anti-editing. And we started by using elongated shots with extended duration, in which a kind of consciousness of the lack of editing would make, as it were, make a consciousness of how editing worked in mainstream film. So the two ideas kind of went together, and we'll see, rather than me talking more about it, we'll see how we used it in Riddles of the Sphinx. We wanted, for our own aesthetic reasons, but also to help the audience, to help the spectator through these quite difficult films, to use pattern and symmetry. So our films tend to have a symmetrical balance. And we also were interested in impure cinema. So not only an imperfect cinema, an impure cinema. So rather than following in the aesthetic purity of artist's film and the purity of the materiality of film itself, but to use music, stories, characters, drama, performance, and so on. And also language. We were also really interested in the place of language in society, again, kind of both psychoanalytically and experimentally in experimental literature, and so on. Also, finally, very important for us was collaboration, not just between us two, but collaboration with our cinematographer, Diane Tams, who was the first of two women cinematographers in the UK. And working with her was really important, and I'd like to talk about that later rather than talk about it now. And also with our composer, Mike Ratledge, who was using electronic equipment, early electronic equipment, to compose. And we kind of left him to compose the music, and we gave him a brief, and he worked on it. So I think those were the main things. I just wanted to end by saying that our films are now thought of as essay films, and I think there is something of the essayistic, but it's also to keep an idea of kind of uncertainty, experiment, attempt, that is really important for this aesthetic. And as it were, a certain kind of cinema of irresolution that would bring up questions rather than giving answers. And I think I'll just stop there, if that's okay, Barbara.
Thank you so much. On va tout de suite voir deux extraits de Riddles of the Sphinx. Donc juste pour vous présenter, ce film est en 7 parties. On a choisi deux courts extraits. Donc l'ouverture du film, c'est les chapitres 1 et 2. Et puis un extrait de la partie centrale du film qui est constitué de plusieurs mouvements panoramiques à 360 degrés. Voilà, pour donner un aperçu. Puis ensuite, on fera circuler la parole.
I think with the opening sequence, first you'll see the idea of hybridity and heterogeneity, of bringing different elements to the screen, and also how the importance of direct address. In our first film, Peter did a sequence of direct address. In this film, it's me, and I have to put up with seeing myself a long time ago. Yeah.
Peut-être une première question que je vais adresser à nos deux invités, c'est cette question du mythe comme un point de départ et du mythe comme une force de questionnement et une énigme. Myth as a questioning force, as a starting point. Why did you need to mediate through narratives that are myths? And also for you, Céline, pour vous, puisque le mythe est aussi présent dans Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, quel est ce rôle possible du mythe?
Well, I never thought about mythology in cinema before writing Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and before writing, there's just one scene that is key to a myth, the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And it wasn't at all part of the plot of the film and even its mental universe while I was writing it. It's really kind of the last idea that came up in the process of writing, and it's kind of, I'm saying it's the last idea not because it's the last that came to my mind, it's when I stopped. It's like in editing, why do you stop to edit your film at some point? It's usually I tend to feel like you have to have one last idea you feel good about. And that's how that's how I know that I must stop, because otherwise it can last very long. And there was this idea of them having a very intellectual discussion, and I was thinking, well, what could be an intellectual discussion that they have back then and that we would have today? I wanted it to feel very familiar, and mythology is quite practical for that in a way. It's like a joke everybody knows in a way. It's very modest. It could seem that you would bring in the film some kind of elderly, ancient stories that would, that you would be the continuity of. It wasn't even that. Mythology is a common ground for fiction, and one that is very democratic, and that's how. And I picked a myth that is very, very well known, and that implies a strong tension with some form of climax. It's. And I didn't even know at the time about Monique Wittig's reinterpretation of the myth. I didn't even know it was such a myth that was so important for feminism. And didn't even realize that it was basically like the gays killing a woman. It's not only that, obviously, but... So I didn't even pick it for its emblematic destiny or whatever. I picked it because it was common, and that there was a strong question in this myth that I wanted this women to discuss. That is also a very common question that we were asking, like, why does he turns? It's very, and it would be very less easy to say why does Oedipus sleeps with his mom and kill his father? That would be a very different discussion. So this one felt playful, and I just wanted them to be playful with ideas and to see them talk. And at some point, I didn't know how much that would change the whole film, actually, because I kind of wanted them to be smart, so I was making them play smart, and so the painter was going like, yeah, but this and this. And at some point I was like, wow, I was into their conversation, and I was like, oh, this talks about the film also. And that's when I decided to actually use the myth as a thread, and that the film would actually end, one of its three endings would be a recollection of the myth, and even in a performative way, because it's the hypothesis that was formulated by Eloise's character, who is played by Adele Haenel, and her hypothesis is that Eurydice says, turn around. Maybe she said it. And to actually make that performative, make that hypothesis win, because the hypothesis that wins is the one that is put into action. It's not the one that's the best. And to actually, and that's when the film got embarked, linked to this myth through this intellectual conversation that I was, really. I had them that they had 2 nights out, they had 2 nights together, and I was like, well, I want them one to play a game, and I want another night to be about an intellectual conversation, and that led the film to be linked to this very ancient mythology.
Thank you. It's also a scene that opens up a variety of interpretation, and I feel that may be a common point with your use of mythology here as a as a more questioning force and asking, but also with the Sphinx and with the previous film, Pentésicilé. I'm not going to. Je vais pas réussir à le dire en anglais. Pentésicilé. These are figures that stand for threatening femininity and standing outside of the norms and in the margins. So, could you perhaps tell us about your use of these myths as a theoretical force in your films?
I think the starting point is very much the same as Céline's, to take stories that are known and that people will recognize and that are part of circulating in our culture, but also to think about retelling stories and how these stories actually open themselves up and ask, in a way, demand to be retold at different moments of history and culture. And so our inspiration, in fact, for the film about the Amazon myth, which was our first film, was the myth of the Amazon queen who fights the Greek hero Achilles. And in one version of the myth, in the ancient version of the myth, he kills her and takes off her helmet and falls in love with her at the moment of her death. And so this is, in a sense, an eroticization of death, but it's also the reduction of the monstrous woman to the object of love, desire, sexuality, when she is reduced no longer to being any of those. But what interested us was that the romantic German writer Heinrich von Kleist had actually retold the story and turned it already upside down. So in his play, Penthesilea kills Achilles and falls in love with him at the moment of his death. So we were interested in the possibility of gender reversals at that point. And what not only gender reversals, but that a gender reversal doesn't involve a reversal of one meaning into the same. It opens up very different kinds of psychological implications. And with the story of Oedipus and the Sphinx, once again, how to reinterpret, retell the story, and to open it up to new characters, as I say in that thing. The Sphinx is the forgotten character, and how to bring the Sphinx back into a central position in the story. So it's, I think, the idea of both familiarity and retelling that makes mythology so interesting. And so the idea, as it's Marianne who suggests that it's Eurydice who's said, turn around.
No, it's Eloise. I think Marianne suggests that he make the poet choice. He decide to remember her rather than love her.
But I think the other point about, which is very different in the use of the Eurydice, Orpheus and Eurydice myth, is it's also lost love and how the loss of love is something that the human mind has to, in a sense, embrace. Would that come into your thinking?
Yes, I think it's Roland Barthes who was saying that it was a very difficult, very sad myth, as if they weren't all, but as if this one was more, we could all connect more easily with it. We have a very sentimental, affectionate... it's still a very romantic myth, and even though you retell it, it stays romantic, and that's why it must really be a myth about love, because love lingers in it, even though you retell it differently.
Et peut-être pour étendre cette question du fait de re-raconter des histoires, et de vous, Céline Sciamma, dans votre film Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, est-ce que vous étiez évidemment conscient de re-raconter une histoire d'amour, une histoire de portrait, avec quelque chose qui est de l'ordre d'une certaine tradition pictural et cinématographique du portrait de l'artiste et de sa muse et d'une histoire d'amour dans un contexte de huis clos, etc. Et de raconter cette histoire en la transformant et en l'amenant ailleurs, ce qui nous ferait un lien avec cette idée de relire les mythes pour leur faire dire, sortir toute leur puissance évocatrice dans un contexte contemporain donné.
Yes, I guess you could say the relationship between an artist and a model is some form of myth, but it would also mean ignore the fact that it's also a lot of abuse, a lot of. That's not only myth. It's a relationship of power that has existed. And so I think it wasn't about telling this myth, adapting it or trying to tell it another way. It was really to tell it from the woman's perspective, really trying to work hard on the sociology of what it was to be a painter at the time, what it was to be a woman painter at the time, and to make it very, very accurate about the context, but to genuinely not try to trick anyone into a new perspective, just embrace fully the perspective of a woman artist and her collaboration with the model, just to take it very, very seriously and to really try to be sincere about another way to politically not just represent it, but live it. And so it wasn't very theoretical. It wasn't as theoretical. I wasn't thinking theoretically. I was trying to work very hard on the context and on giving back and on trying to resist the idea that, because when you look at the context, you know about the opportunities, and there were, so especially for the woman artist at that time, there were some opportunities. So you're looking at real opportunities. It's not a fake opportunity I'm giving to a lady here in the past. And you're looking at a true alternative, because it does exist, and also because it's not that far from, I decided it wasn't that far from my experience as an artist, and also, or as someone who falls in love. So it was really about, being accurate about the context, the impossibilities and possibilities of that context, and within that context, give them back all their bodies and desires without any form of fear of anachronism, because we have worked very hard on not making any anachronism, and because it's not a utopia. It's I'm sure this story and this relationship existed.
But can I just add there, Céline, I think one way in which the relationship between artist and model is completely transformed is that it's the model who questions the first image, and she says, "This isn't good enough. This is not me." So in that sense, it makes the model into a very active, participatory. It makes it a collaboration in a sense between the two.
Yes, but I do believe that if you leave space, that this could have existed. This existed. I'm pretty sure that, and I mean the models, they were obviously part of the conversation. Most of them were sex workers, and we have to acknowledge how much sex workers have had an impact on history of art. It's amazing. Most of them were also artists, and it's really so. Yes, it's. I'm not trying to break that rule. I'm trying to embody a rule that I haven't been transmitted, but I do believe existed, even though it's not. There's no trace of it. Maybe, lacking archives in a way of those relationships.
But that's, in a sense, retrieving women's history, because precisely women's history has not been told. It's not in the archives. So, in a sense, it needs the kind of historical research that you did, and to retrieve the stories that emerge out of those obvious possibilities. So it is, in a sense, giving these women their history back.
And continuity throughout our histories, because that's the big loss of not having our own archives. It's that we are missing the fact that our ideas are very ancient. They always come up as new. they are very ancient. It's just that sometimes we are lacking, we feel we're missing a trace. For instance, with Petite Maman, the film I did after was working on some form of new mythology rather than relying on interpreting a former myth. I really felt it was a myth that existed, which is a mother and a daughter, or a kid and its parents hanging out together at the same age. I'm pretty sure this story, I didn't feel like, oh, that's a good idea. I felt like, oh, this very ancient story reached me. And now I'm going to have to tell it my way. So even when I seem to have an idea that I feel is original, I'm not thinking it's mine. I'm thinking I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to be sent this idea by patriarchal mythology, wherever that is, and that you should always write the story as an interpretation of the myth, even though you feel like you've got this pitch, this high tension. You should adapt that. I think it's always about adapting some form of myth.
Peut-être Chloé, tu veux prendre la parole? We're going to delve into issues of the gaze in the text and films, but maybe Chloé, who hasn't spoken yet, can start.
In my research, I'm trying to set up a theoretical frame, to analyze naked bodies in representations on stages, contemporary stages.
Can I just interrupt for a sec?
Yeah.
Is that naked bodies of women or of both male and female?
It's both. I didn't want to put it like a gendered frame at the beginning. Yeah. So it's really about both. Yeah. But precisely like the gender, the question of gender intervenes very, very slowly. Precisely? Yeah, no, ça arrive très tôt. Early, yeah, sorry. When you see, you try to read what philosophers say about nakedness. You see that very, very frequently. You have like male philosophers trying to make like very abstract and very interesting theories about nakedness. Like, for example, nakedness is not the naked body. The naked body can be, an artifact that you decide. It's an artistic choice, and it's something that you can touch, you can sense. The nakedness is what happens between two bodies, between the performer and the viewer. So it's a very intersubjective, intercorporeal event. And some philosophers, like contemporary philosophers, say that very well. People like Georges Didier Huberman or Giorgio Agamben or Jean-Luc Nancy. But they are always taking examples with implicitly female objects, female models, and male viewers. So in this frame, you have to mix phenomenology with something else. Il faut croiser une approche phénoménologique avec une déconstruction des normes de la représentation et des rapports de pouvoir. And in this moment, your thinking was important to me. So I came up reading your article that you published in 1975, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, in the journal Screen, I think. And this article explains very well how and maybe why the female body is so important in making the image, and especially in making images of sexuality.
Yeah. I think one problem that I have in dealing with the ways in which that essay, I mean, I'm always delighted that the essay has been useful and that it's been adopted in very, very many different ways by different disciplines. But my inspiration for that essay was Hollywood cinema, which is one of the most censored cinemas in the world. and there's no nudity at all. But on the other hand, it's highly sexualized and highly gendered. So, for instance, to go back to poor old Freud, Freud, in thinking about the human psyche, thought there was no such thing as the human psyche that was purely male or purely female, and he was using the terms metaphorically anyway, in a old-fashioned misogynistic way, for male to evoke activity and female to evoke passivity. And he thought that no human psyche is anything but a mix of these things, whereas Hollywood cinema gendered it completely, so that almost exclusively, not necessarily totally exclusively, but the female had to take the role of passivity and the male activity. Now, what I don't think I emphasized sufficiently in the essay, because the essay was a manifesto, there was no academic context at the time. I wrote it, as it were, out of my immediate responses to the problem of Hollywood cinema as I saw it at the time. But one of the questions that I think arises out of Hollywood is why the figure of the male has to be so active. And it's partly to do with the taboo on homosexuality, the terror that the beautiful male movie star would be the object of female pleasure on the screen. So to defend against that possibility, the male star has to be almost constantly in motion and leading the story, driving the other action, and carrying everything forward. And I think I remember you saying, Céline, that one of the ways in which you approach storytelling was in a way to try and break down that insistence on the linear, the drive forward, the sense that always something had to happen next. So I think there's a kind of complicated erotic neurosis there. And it's also interesting if you look back to the 1920s, and my very dear friend Miriam Hansen wrote very interesting essays on the 1920s movie star, who I'm sure no one here will have heard of anymore, Rudolph Valentino. Can you put your hand up if you've heard of Rudolph Valentino? Oh, that's wonderful. That's great, yeah. Rudolph Valentino caused a kind of neurotic crisis in American masculinity at the time, because he was both a love object for American women, but he also, because he was the object of the gaze, represented an emasculated feminine masculinity. So he was too complicated for the patriarchal psyche to cope with. So, in a sense, he had to die. And without going on about Valentino, but how many of his movies involve sadomasochistic scenes of him being beaten and humiliated in various ways, and then reasserting his beauty rather than, as it were, a macho masculinity. And it's an interesting question, which we won't necessarily go into now, that this was also the period of the flapper girl, who was quite active and energetic. And there's a wonderful moment when Clara Bow, the great flapper actress, the beginning of the movie It, sees the male movie star and says, "Sweet Santa Claus, give me him." And it's a reversal. And this was in the 20s. And somehow sound cinema or the Depression or the economic crisis or Roosevelt brought back the active male. So all I'm saying is that my ideas came from this very censored and very repressed cinema, and which made it very much easier for me to analyze. And it's much more complicated, I think, to address the kinds of questions that you're addressing, Chloe. I was also interested in the way that the language of cinema works on gendered lines. But I also wondered if we could, if you could perhaps give us some examples of how you could think that there might be perhaps a progressive use of nudity in performance and on the stage.
Yes, maybe I can, if you're interested in that question, I can talk about the work of two choreographers. The first is Gaëlle Bourges. She's a French choreographer, and she works a lot with history of art. So, for example, one of her shows is called. Sorry, I am just. J'hésite entre tous ces spectacles, sont très intéressants. Donc,
in my introduction, I was emphasizing the importance in our period and in our moment of a negative aesthetic, in which the question perhaps of nudity and the female body was very much something that had to be reacted against. And I could ask both you and Céline, because I think perhaps the moment of negativity has shifted, and it's now much more possible within a feminine aesthetic to address these questions more freely. And obviously in the portrait, you do. And perhaps we could...
Yes, so maybe I have an example which I can relate with Céline's work. So the show now... I know it. It's called La Belle De France, and it's about you have three performers performing just poses, which are like reenactments of very well-known traditional paintings. So, for example, Olympia. Or the Venus by Tintoretto, things like this, and they are repeating these poses, the three synchronized with props and a very choreographical, very ritualized cycle of movements. And in the La Voix Off is at the beginning of the show. An art historian, very well known in France, Daniel Arras, a famous art historian, talking about the analysis of these paintings. So you have really the contrast between the models, the mute and perfect models behind their props and costumes, and the voice of the historian who knows and can reveal the truth about the paintings and interpret it. And at the end, there is another part when you can hear voices of these same performers who were both of them, the three ones, they were also sex workers in another moment of their lives. Before, and they are talking about the scenes they have with clients off stage after the strip, and how the clients ask them to take certain roles, certain gendered, parts, like for example, in a sadomasochistic scenario, and at this moment, they are still performing all these poses of Olympia, the Venus, etc. And you suddenly see this contrast between the lived and bodily experience of the models and the construction, the building of the image.
That's fascinating, because in a sense it relates immediately back to our earlier conversation about mythologies. Because they're, rather than mythologies, it's three well-known paintings which people can recognize, and then the stories can be retold, and the stories behind the stories exposed.
It's nudity as a quote. And I think that's what we can all, that's the moment where we are now, even as feminists, as women. It's because we're asking, can we put a woman naked on screen? That's it. That's the question. And our answer so far is, it's nakedness as a quote. This is nakedness as a quote. And because we're all thinking about how many times these images have been, how many times have we been naked on screen, And I guess we are at this very hybrid moment where we are. I mean, it's always hybrid moment, because when Alice Guy was looking at women and women's bodies, she was already doing it very differently. Laurie Fuller also. So once more, it's about this continuity of our ideas, which means that as our ideas ancient, we are quoting also these women from the past or these images from the past. But what we are all waiting for is new sexy, which means a sexy that wouldn't be a quote or unaware of, that wouldn't be so aware of its politics. That would
a what? You said it.
A sexiness that wouldn't be so aware of politics, or that wouldn't be part of that would surprise us. And
But don't you think that that's what you do?
Absolutely. No, I don't know. I'm trying.
Yes.
But I haven't. I'm trying, but so far I'm trying to. It's hard to try. I'm trying with humor so far. I'm trying with humor because I think that's something we've been missing a lot. A presentation of sexuality with humor. And maybe that's the biggest gap there is between what we live and what we experience, is that there's no humor at all. So far my solution is this, which is not a quote, but if I had to go with full frontal intercourse between two persons, I still don't know how I would do that. I still don't know. And I'm very much looking into the answers of my colleagues. And what I'm sure is that I always feel it's a safe space to watch those scenes whenever I feel that the question is alive. If I feel somebody has been asking, if I feel the director has been asking himself or herself the question, you know it. Otherwise, you know that they've just been doing it. And I think that's already something that is a spark, because, it's not about being turned on. It's not about being turned on. It's about being turned on. So at least if I'm like, oh, they've been asking themselves the question of how to do it. And that can either be with the editing or the staging of the scene, but that can also be in the balance of power on the set. It can be with the fact that somebody was there as a stunt manager to, I don't know, you said the coordinateur d'intimité. This can also be this. But it's at least they ask themselves the question, and I think it's a question that hasn't been investigated much, and it's been very brutal and shy at the same time.
This raises a question of spectatorship that you have started to talk about, Chloé. If we return to your article, Visual Pleasure, there's this idea of breaking the pleasure that we have going to movies as spectators as an initial polemic stance. And in the case of your film, Céline, there's of course a great desire to create an emotional involvement of the spectator, identification, and to create a form of visual pleasure and to rework that idea of desire in the circulation of gazes. So could you perhaps expand a bit more on that tension between reinventing a form of circulation of the visual pleasure in a new way?
I suppose if I could just say something first, which is that in my analysis in the visual pleasure essay, I didn't want to suggest that this way in which the look was invested with power was a universal. I was identifying it as a voyeuristic tendency in a certain cinema, and not even saying that all cinema is voyeuristic, but that there was a tendency in the way that the power dynamic in patriarchal society was organized for it to lapse into that power dynamic on the screen, and that certain industrial cinemas, par excellence, would be glad to fall into and reproduce that power dynamic. So I think that one of the beauties of the artist and model concept that you work with is to directly address the question of the look and how to transform it into something else, and which I think you do. But perhaps you could answer Barbara's question.
Yeah, it's the plot of the film. The plot of the film is not. I mean, the film has no secrets in a way. I really wanted it to be up front, but I don't. Was this a question? I don't.
Peut-être que ce qu'on peut faire, c'est.
Could ask in a way, perhaps, is that the way I saw it was the way it's the way that the look becomes. I can't think of the right word because it's quite subtle. That the look becomes almost like touch, and there's a way in which the look can become a caress, if you see what I mean, rather than an act of kind of power, and it becomes textual, if that makes sense. And I wondered if that happens at all. Perhaps if Céline could answer. Yeah.
I tend to think that more and more as the screen as a skin, and I'm kind of not interested in the concept of identification. I used to try to use it because it's so common that it's what happens in cinema, and that even our problematic with representation would be that we couldn't identify. That men couldn't identify to women on screen or whatever. And I think this is part of the scam. I think it's part of the scam. I think identification is quite a poor idea of what is expected from fiction in general and cinema. And it's because it's action-driven, maybe, for so long that it has been about identification. I think it's also because, and I don't know if I'm saying something very stupid historically, but I've been told that, you might tell me I'm wrong, but that also as women have been mostly the audience of cinema, still are statistically, and especially in the cinema of the origin, and then capitalism, cinema was being more and more economically, I mean, you were rich, you were doing cinema, money was then inside this, and that's when they wanted to trigger male audience to come. It's like the Oscars, the genderless plot. The fact that we are not trying to go back to genderless prize. At first, the prize, they were genderless. It was best interpretation. It wasn't best male or best female. But the men kept losing. So they decided to create two categories. And maybe this idea that suddenly the male-driven character has taken so much space without clearly being something we could, with cutting with the eroticism, making it all about action, so that men would go to cinema. Because yes, of course, your article was about Hollywood, but then my generation went through the 80s, the 90s, the action hero. I mean, it went worse, and it worked. And now, yes, because now it's fan servicing, so it's that culture that worked. It's suddenly that Star Wars, suddenly men go to the cinema, and then you're fan servicing the fans, which are mostly the male, because it's crazy how women go to the cinema, but cinephilia is masculine, You can't tell when this is true, but we know this isn't the truth,
yes,
right?
That's quite right. Sorry to interrupt, Céline, but I mean that's quite right, because in the 1920s, the box office was women, and then you had the beautiful male stars, and so in a way to get the men back into the cinema, you had to masculinize it. And I think in my argument, the women in the audience, by and large, became men because there was no alternative offered to us.
You told about the kind of cross-gendered identification of the female spectator in your other article that you wrote after visual pleasure in narrative cinema, which is Afterthoughts on visual pleasure. And maybe you could say something about it, even if it's also about a certain kind of, a certain genre of cinema.
I think it was partly my own experience that going to the kinds of male-dominated films that Céline has been evoking for us. In a way, the woman in the cinema has two alternatives. One, to follow the identification processes, as you were describing, the identification which then is more or less imposed on by the story, by the male action. So you become a man, but you're still a woman. So it's a kind of, you could call it almost a kind of trans, a kind of hermaphroditic situation in which there's no stability. And so I found that an interesting position to be in, a spectator in a cinema that's supposed to give total stability to the way of looking, that actually the woman has to be somewhat uncertain and unstable. And that seemed to me to be an interesting paradox. And I think that was when I was describing earlier the way I started quite suddenly seeing films in a new way. I stopped seeing them from following the male perspective, and I started watching them as a woman, and watching rather than identifying. And instead of feeling moved, tears, laughter, emotion, feeling a certain kind of irritation and annoyance. Why were the women always left like this? Why was it, etc., etc.? Anyway, as you can imagine. But I just wanted to be struck by something that Céline said about comedy, because I think there are exceptions in comedy where you break the rules and the world can be turned upside down.